The cabin was alive with chatter as passengers settled into their seats. The hum of excitement in the air was palpable as the flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisles, ensuring everything was in order. Emma was already feeling the strain of a long day of flying, but she kept a professional smile on her face. As she walked past rows of eager travelers, she noticed the elderly man standing near the back of the plane. He was tall, but hunched with age. His white hair, disheveled from the wind outside his hands, clutched a cane that looked far too thin to support him with the burden of time that seemed to have taken its toll on his body. He moved slowly, his every step deliberate and careful, as though each one required an immense amount of effort. Passengers continued to board the plane, oblivious to the man's struggle as they rushed to take their seats and settle in for the journey. Emma tried to keep her attention focused on the task at hand, but her gaze kept drifting back to the elderly man. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the hesitance with which he moved, as if this wasn't his first time traveling alone. But it was clear this journey had taken its toll on him. She sighed softly to herself. She had seen so many passengers over the years, those who needed extra help, those who were too proud to ask for it. She had dealt with difficult people who expected too much and annoying ones who couldn't follow basic instructions. It was just another day in the air, another set of passengers, another set of demands that would need to be met. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to let distractions pull her focus. But still her thoughts kept drifting back to the elderly man, his cane tapping softly on the floor with each step. The plane finally filled to capacity, and the boarding process was nearing its end. When Emma walked down the aisle once more, her eyes flicked toward him as he sat down slowly in his assigned seat near the window. He winced slightly as he lowered himself into the chair, his hand gripping the armrest for support. His movements were slow and careful, almost like a routine that had been practiced too many times. She couldn't help but wonder how long it had been since he last traveled alone, or if he ever had someone to help him with such a journey. Her hand gripped the drink cart tightly as she moved down the aisle, pushing past rows of passengers who were settling in for the flight. When she finally reached the elderly man, he looked up at her with a faint smile, his eyes full of age, but still kind. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, as he asked for a simple glass of water. Emma's heart didn't soften. Instead, she felt a slight annoyance stir within her. It wasn't the first time she had been asked to get something so simple. It wasn't the first time someone had asked for water, but it felt different. Somehow she glanced at him, then quickly looked away as she shook her head slightly, her lips forming a tight smile. As she nodded before turning to continue down the aisle, she didn't stop to consider that maybe this was more than just a request for water. Maybe it was a plea for some small kindness, or maybe it was a signal that something more was wrong than she realized. Emma moved briskly down the aisle. The sound of the cartwheels rolling over the floor was the only noise breaking the stillness of the cabin. The elderly man's request for water lingered in her mind, but she dismissed it almost immediately. She had other things to focus on. There were passengers to check on, more people to serve. It was just another part of the job. No need to overthink it, she thought to herself. But the nagging feeling didn't quite leave her as she continued her work. It wasn't the first time she had been asked for something simple, but for some reason this request felt different. It was something about the way he had looked at her, those tired eyes, that seemed to carry more than just the weight of his age. There was something in his gaze, a silent pleading, that made her feel uneasy. But she pushed the thought away. After all, she had a job to do. She didn't have time to dwell on every passenger's needs. Sometimes it was easier to pretend she didn't notice when someone needed a little extra help. It was easier to keep things moving smoothly without drawing attention to herself or anyone else. But as the minutes passed, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt deep down. She knew she hadn't been as kind as she could have been. She hadn't even offered to help him. She hadn't stopped to really see him for what he was, an elderly man alone on a flight, struggling to take care of himself. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long day, or the pressure of having to please so many people. But Emma couldn't shake the thought of him sitting there quietly with nothing but a simple request for water. He didn't ask for much, just something to quench his thirst. But she had ignored him, she had dismissed him. As though he didn't matter, no one else seemed to notice that the man quietly sipped from the glass of water. The flight attendant, before Emma had given him his earlier request forgotten and buried in the business of the flight, Emma tried to focus on her responsibilities. She walked up and down the aisles assisting other passengers, making small talk as she went along, but her mind kept drifting back to him. She couldn't remember his face exactly, but she remembered the feeling of his gaze on her, those tired eyes that seemed to say so much without uttering a word. Maybe it was the loneliness in his stare, maybe it was the quiet resignation of someone who had travelled too many times to expect kindness anymore. She wasn't sure, but she couldn't help but feel like she had failed him. Somehow, as the flight continued on, she tried to distract herself with her work, serving drinks and snacks, chatting with passengers. But the feeling of regret clung to her. The more she thought about it, the worse it felt. She kept replaying the moment in her head, how she had brushed him off without a second thought, how she hadn't even stopped to ask if he needed help. If she had done that, maybe things would be different. Maybe he wouldn't have looked so alone. But it was too late now. The thought lingered like an ache in the pit of her stomach. The flight was starting to settle into a rhythm. The hum of the engines drowned out the occasional chatter and the clinking of trays being cleaned up. Emma moved through the aisles once again, checking on the passengers. She had almost forgotten about the elderly man, but every now and then her mind would wander back to him, his soft request echoing in her thoughts. But she did her best to ignore it. There was nothing she could do now, no way to go back and change the moment when she had passed him by. She couldn't help but wonder, though, if he was okay, if he had gotten the help he needed. He had seemed fine when she last saw him, just sitting there in his seat, looking out the window with his cane resting beside him. But something gnawed at her as she moved past him again, this time a little more quickly than before. She didn't want to face the guilt that had started to creep up on her. No one else seemed to notice the man, or maybe they did, but chose to look away, just like she had. He wasn't a priority. He was just another passenger to them. And that's how she treated him too. She couldn't afford to get involved in every little thing. She had to keep moving, keep serving the passengers, without stopping too long to think about them beyond their immediate needs. But just as she walked past him, a sudden jolt shook the plane. The seatbelt signs blinked on, and a collective gasp went through the cabin. The plane lurched and swayed violently. Emma grabbed the nearest seat back to steady herself, her heart pounding as she looked around in panic. The turbulence was unlike anything she had felt before, and the sense of unease spread through the cabin. Passengers were clutching their armrests. Some were even clutching each other in fear. And amid the chaos, Emma's eyes instinctively darted toward the elderly man. His face was ashen, and his hands gripped the armrests with all the strength he could muster. But he was trembling, his breaths shallow and quick, his eyes wide with fear. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just turbulence. This was something worse. The man was struggling to breathe, and the realization hit her like a wave. She had ignored him. She had dismissed his earlier request as unimportant, and now he was fighting for air. She rushed to his side, her heart racing with each step. She felt the weight of her earlier actions pressing down on her. As she knelt beside him, she could see the panic in his eyes. He was trying to speak, but no words came out, just shallow gasps for air. Emma's mind raced. She had no time to think of the guilt, no time to think of anything but getting him the help he needed. She had to act fast before it was too late. Emma's hands shook as she tried to assess the situation. The elderly man's breathing was labored and shallow. His eyes locked onto hers in a frantic plea for help. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew she had to act fast, but panic was beginning to take hold of her thoughts. She had seen passengers faint before. She had seen people struggle with their seatbelts in turbulence, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, this raw vulnerability. She knelt beside him, and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Her voice was shaky as she tried to comfort him, asking if he was okay. But he couldn't answer, only gasped for air, his chest rising and falling erratically. The turbulence continued to shake the plane violently. It made everything feel more intense, like time was slowing down and speeding up at the same time. Every second stretched into eternity. She reached over to press the emergency call button, but her hands felt like they were moving in slow motion. She could barely think straight. All she could focus on was his panicked face staring up at her in helplessness. She needed to get him help. She needed to do something. But what could she do here in the middle of the air? She felt the weight of her earlier dismissal suddenly crushing her. She hadn't even offered him that glass of water. How could she have been so careless, so detached from his simple need for kindness now? He was struggling to breathe, and she was helpless. All she could do was try to keep him calm. She spoke to him softly, telling him to breathe slowly. That help was on the way, but her words felt empty, like they couldn't reach him. Through the panic, she could see the fear in his eyes, the realization dawning on her that she had been wrong. All along she had dismissed him without a second thought, and now she was watching him suffer. Because of it, the guilt in her chest grew heavier with every passing second. She glanced around the cabin looking for help, but the chaos of the turbulence was making it impossible to focus. The other passengers were trying to steady themselves. Some were even holding on to their seats in terror. Emma felt alone in the chaos. She was the only one who could help him. But she wasn't trained for this. She wasn't equipped to handle a medical emergency. At 30,000 feet, her thoughts were racing as she tried to think of what to do next. But her mind was clouded by her own self-doubt. The sound of her own heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She needed to get him help. She needed to stop feeling sorry for herself and act quickly before it was too late. She leaned in closer, her hand still on his shoulder, urging him to stay with her. Even as the turbulence rocked the plane back and forth, the feeling of helplessness surged through her like an electric shock. The elderly man's grip on her hand tightened, as if he was trying to hold on to whatever bit of hope she could give him. But Emma didn't know if it was enough. The turbulence refused to let up. The plane seemed to be caught in a violent storm. The air around Emma felt thick and suffocating. As she continued to hold the elderly man's hand, she could feel the warmth of his grip, but it was weak and trembling. His eyes never left hers, as if trying to communicate something beyond words. His face had turned an unnatural shade of pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Emma could feel her own heart pounding in her chest. She was certain that she wasn't equipped for this, not like she should be. The hours of training seemed so distant now. All the safety protocols and procedures they had taught her were nothing compared to the raw panic unfolding before her eyes. She glanced toward the cockpit in desperation, hoping the captain would have information or instructions. But the narrow aisle between the rows of seats seemed miles long in that moment. She couldn't tear her focus away from the elderly man. His shallow breathing quickened as the turbulence made every second feel like an eternity. She knelt beside him, trying to keep him as still as possible, speaking softly, telling him to breathe deeply. But her own voice trembled with uncertainty. Her own words seemed hollow. She needed help. She needed someone who knew what they were doing. But the minutes dragged on, and the only thing she could do was try to calm him and hope that someone else would intervene before it was too late. The man's grip tightened once more, his frail hand desperately clutching at her fingers, as if holding on to her was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. His eyes locked onto hers with a pleading look, his mouth moving slightly, but no words came out, only a hoarse, rasping breath. Emma felt the panic rise in her chest. She had never felt so out of control, so helpless. She had to make sure he was okay, had to do something before it was too late. But her mind was a blur with no clear path forward. She could feel the flight attendants around her trying to stabilize themselves as well. But the situation was too intense, too out of control, for anyone to offer the help she so desperately needed. She had to make a decision. She couldn't wait for someone to tell her what to do. She had to act. So she pressed the button again with urgency. The lights flashed bright above her as the call for assistance rang out. But even as she waited for someone to arrive, the seconds, dragged by endlessly, the turbulence grew fiercer, making the plane sway wildly to the left and right. But still she held on to his hand, trying to steady him, her breath coming in short bursts. As the fear and guilt gripped her heart, every passing moment felt like a countdown, like something terrible was about to happen. And all she could do was pray that she was wrong, that the situation wouldn't spiral out of control. But deep down she knew it already had. She had made a mistake earlier, a small one, but one that seemed to matter more now than ever. She had turned away from him then, and now she couldn't make it right. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thick and suffocating with each passing moment. The turbulence continued to shake the plane, but Emma barely noticed the jolts. Now her focus was entirely on the elderly man, his chest rising and falling erratically, each breath a struggle. He looked at her with wide eyes that spoke volumes of fear and desperation. Emma's heart raced, her mind whirring in panic as she tried to think clearly, but every thought seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. She could feel his hand gripping hers tighter, almost as if he was trying to tell her something without words. But all she could hear was the frantic thudding of her own heart. Every instinct told her to stay calm, to think rationally, but nothing seemed rational in this moment. All she could feel was the weight of her guilt pressing down on her shoulders, making it harder to breathe. The sound of the emergency call button buzzing above her made her flinch. It felt too loud, too intrusive, like an urgent reminder of how out of control everything had become. She glanced at the other flight attendants, who were huddled in their own corners of the plane trying to stabilize themselves, or help the other passengers, who were clearly terrified by the violent turbulence. There was nothing anyone could do, though, nothing anyone could do for him. It felt as though the whole world was slipping away as she watched the man struggle to keep his breath steady. She could feel her own breath quickening, her body tensing with every labored gasp. He made his lips were slightly parted, and his eyes were glazed over with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Emma's thoughts raced. What was happening? Why hadn't anyone come to help yet? She thought back to the training sessions and medical protocols they had drilled into her during her time as a flight attendant, but nothing felt adequate now. It wasn't enough to calm him down or stop the chaos. The cabin was alive with tension, the other passengers whispering or quietly praying, but the focus was on her and the elderly man in front of her, as though the whole flight was holding its breath. Emma felt utterly powerless. Her mind replayed the moment when she had dismissed him earlier, the nagging voice in the back of her head, telling her that she could have done more if only she had been more patient, if only she had seen the fear in his eyes earlier. Now it was too late to take it back. She couldn't undo what had been done. She could only hope that her actions now would be enough. But what if they weren't? What if she was too late? She couldn't stand the thought of him slipping away right there in front of her. After everything, after the way she had treated him, she had failed him. She had been too quick to judge, too busy to stop and truly see him for who he was. And now, in his final moments, she had no way to fix the past. All she could do was hold on to him and pray that help would come soon, praying that somehow she could save him, even though deep down she knew the odds were slipping away with each passing second. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as Emma knelt beside the elderly man, his grip on her hand tightening with every labored breath. She could feel the heat of his hand, but it was weak and trembling, like the last flickers of a dying flame. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, and each time it seemed harder for him to catch his breath. Emma was frantic, her mind racing with thoughts of what she should do next. But all of it felt too late. Nothing seemed to matter anymore, except the man in front of her. His face was pale now, and his eyes had lost some of their clarity. They seemed distant, like he was slipping away from her. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let him die on this plane. Not like this. The turbulence shook the plane again, more violently than before, and the entire cabin seemed to tremble. Passengers were whispering in hushed voices. Some of them were clutching their seatbacks, and others were looking up nervously. Emma felt the chaos around her, but it all seemed distant now. It didn't matter. All she could hear was the man's weak breath and her own pulse pounding in her ears. She squeezed his hand tighter, trying to hold on to him, as if by some miracle it would keep him here with her, keep him alive. But she knew that wasn't enough. She had to do more. She had to be more. But she was failing him. She was failing herself and him all over again. The guilt tightened around her chest, so tightly that she thought she might suffocate under its weight. Why hadn't she been more attentive when he had asked for that glass of water? Why hadn't she paid more attention to the way he had looked at her, his eyes pleading for something more than just a drink? Why hadn't she seen the signs? Why hadn't she known that he might be struggling? Why hadn't she been better? Emma's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement. From the aisle, a flight attendant had rushed over with a medical kit, and without wasting a second, she dropped to her knees beside Emma and the elderly man. She could feel a shift in the air as the other flight attendants began to spring into action. Now they had a plan. They had the training that Emma felt so utterly lacking in. She stepped back a little and let them work. The medical attendant immediately began checking the man's pulse and breathing, while another colleague moved quickly to get more oxygen. The urgency in the air was palpable, but Emma could still feel her stomach twist with the lingering guilt. It was too little, too late. She thought it didn't matter how many medical supplies they had, or how quickly they acted. Nothing would change the fact that she had ignored him when he needed her the most. Nothing would change the fact that it was her mistake that had put him in this position. She couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over in her head, and each time it felt like a deeper betrayal. But the flight attendants were working quickly and methodically now, and slowly the man's breathing seemed to ease. The oxygen mask was in place, and his chest began to rise and fall more evenly. Emma watched with bated breath, praying silently that he would make it through the storm she had caused. The plane finally began to steady. As the turbulence slowly subsided, the cabin was still filled with a tense silence, the kind that only comes after a moment of collective panic. Emma stayed crouched beside the elderly man, watching as the medical attendants continued to work, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from his face. His breathing had improved slightly, but he still looked pale and fragile. Emma's heart was heavy with guilt. It was hard to shake the feeling that she had failed him the moment when he had asked for that glass of water, and she had brushed him off, replayed in her mind over and over like a constant reminder of her mistake. She had seen his weakness, his struggle, and yet had chosen to ignore it for something so insignificant, for the sake of convenience. She had never imagined this would happen. She had never thought that his simple request might have been a silent cry for help. But now she knew better. She could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She could have done more. She should have done more. The man's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, his gaze soft, but still full of uncertainty and fear. He looked at Emma, his lips parting, as if to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at her for a long time, and Emma could feel her chest tighten with sorrow. She wanted to say something, but she didn't know what. Could she apologize? Would it even matter at this point? What could she say to make up for the moments she had lost? What could she say to take away the pain of watching him struggle alone? She leaned in closer, her voice shaky, as she asked if he was okay. He nodded slightly and gave her a weak smile, the kind of smile that was more out of politeness than comfort. But it was something. It was enough to make her feel like there was hope. She stayed by his side as the flight attendants continued their work, giving him oxygen and ensuring he was stable. But Emma's mind was still lost in the guilt. She couldn't escape from it. No matter how much she wanted to make things right, she knew that she couldn't undo what had already happened. The flight continued on without incident, but the feeling of regret never left her. It hung over her like a cloud for the rest of the journey. When the plane finally landed and the emergency medical team rushed on board. Emma stepped back quietly watching as they took over. She felt a mixture of relief and anxiety, but mostly she just felt small. She couldn't help but wonder if the man would ever look at her again, if he would remember the way she had ignored him, or if he would even be okay after all of this. As the passengers disembarked, she watched him slowly make his way down the aisle once more with the help of the medical team. He gave her one last look before turning away, and Emma couldn't help but feel like a piece of her heart was left behind with that look. She had failed him, but somehow she knew she would never forget this lesson.